Leach, who is a senior training and consultation specialist in Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling. He provides training, consultation, and technical assistance for the Community Support Services Initiative, along with other projects. Earl has over 25 years of experience in behavioral healthcare management, administration, and supervision in New Jersey, New York, Virginia, and Massachusetts. And with a teary eye, I'm going to now turn it over to Earl.
I appreciate it, Dawn. Thank you. And thank you all for being with us on this topic. Based on what I learned is one that is not only topical, but is as desired. And hopefully, as we get through today's material, we will find that it is informative and impactful in terms of how you operate in your day-to-day operations. Documentation, as we know, it is an essential component of delivering services, particularly services that are reviewed and audited repeatedly. For those who may not know this, I think it's more common than not. There's that concept of if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. So there's that belief, that nuance, that documenting all the great work you're doing really allows both yourself to have a sense as to how your actions and activities may have impacted the outcome desired in the process, as well as to really ensure that you are compliant with the guidance, licensure, and compliant element of what you do. And a part of that process is to ensure that the documentation is really aligned with expectations and standards of the funders and ethical and professional standards as well. Hence why we have really arrived at and agreed upon a standard approach or a framework that is consistent across most documentation in our field. And that is the golden thread of documentation, which really provides that consistent, standard, comprehensive framework for not only providing the service, but guiding the way we document and archive our processes throughout an episode of service, and to really gauge and evaluate the outcome of those efforts. So the golden thread, as it is really a vital resource for maintaining compliance, reimbursement, and ensuring a delivery of quality care. And that's important because oftentimes when we speak of the golden thread or any kind of framework for documentation, the first thought that comes to mind is that of, oh, this is meeting compliance, and this is basically providing us in a safe place or a comfortable place when we are being audited. But it's more than simply compliance and licensure standard. It really speaks to a guideline and a framework for ensuring that quality service is provided and how we measure and articulate that quality care that really speaks to the outcomes desired. And we'll look at that some more. So what is today's objective? What is the takeaway we hope you gain from today's engagement? First, we want to make sure that we clearly define what is the golden thread and explain why is it important for us to not only be in alignment with the golden thread, but truly understand the components of it and the purpose of it all. We want to examine the connections between the golden thread and psychiatric rehabilitation, which is the standard way of delivering services within the state hospitals and across most of the services provided for people with severe and persistent mental illness. We want to also look at the relationship between golden thread and Medicaid and third-party funders. Why is it that they ascribe to, they promote, they ensure that the golden thread is the standard framework for documentation across all the services and programs that they fund? We want to also outline the best practices in psychiatric rehabilitation that support strength-based goal planning, and the provision of intentional services, and how Medicaid compliant documentation relates to all that. So maybe ambitious, but at the end of the day, it really has a clear connection and an alignment across the entire process of thinking about and operationalizing documentation and processing services to ensure that we are compliant, we are providing quality services, and we have a clear and definitive framework for doing so consistently across all services we provide. So that's our objective, and that's what we hope that you take away from today's engagement. So what is this golden thread that we talk about so purposefully? For those who may not be aware of it, or it may be something that they've heard somewhere along the line early in your training course, or maybe something you are speaking to often as you prepare for an audit, it is important to know that the golden thread is really a critical component. It's an essential element of ensuring and demonstrating the provision of quality care, meeting accreditation and compliance standards, and also ensuring that your documentation of the service you provided meet the standard for reimbursement. If it's not written, it's not done. If it's not written according to compliance standards and accreditation, you can't bill for it. So there's that connection. Bottom line, it ensures that people on the receiving end of service get quality of service they desire and need and is expected. Those services can be effectively demonstrated in terms of its outcomes, and ultimately you can ensure that you get reimbursed for those services to maintain the provision of those services. So the golden thread really looks at the connection between all the elements of good quality care, from assessment to service planning to providing the services in terms of the interventions, and ensuring that you document it using comprehensive, positive reflecting progress notes that really reflect the whole comprehensive services, the outcome from those services, and the recipient of those services' reaction to those services. And it all stems from that big idea that the golden thread really ensures Medicaid reimbursement at this level of services, but more importantly, it provides a documentation framework that supports best practices in psychiatric rehabilitation. In other words, it supports rehabilitation and recovery for individuals receiving mental health services. That's the ultimate goal. And that's the really definitive purpose of this all. It's not simply a way of someone keeping track of what you're doing or documenting, but it's to ensure that what you are providing, whom you're providing to, are on the receiving end of quality care, and you can demonstrate the efforts and the outcomes in order to be reimbursed and continue that service. Hope that really pulls things together and put it into a category that makes simple but practical sense. So what does that process look like? So oftentimes there's that belief that the golden thread starts at the first time you put pen to paper, you start documenting, or you're sitting at your computer. But in essence, the golden thread really begins at the first engagement in services. Because you start thinking about how you're providing these services and how you will archive and narrate it, and then document it and put it into a historical framework in order for it to be reviewed. So we started engagement. There are documented assessed needs. You demonstrate medical necessity. You assess strengths of and the needs of the person that you are providing services to. And you go along that process from identifying goal and developing a service plan to providing intentional, purposeful, meaningful, impactful services. And then you document those services But in doing so, you ensure that the services tie back to the plan, those agreed upon contracted arrangements between you and the client, and also it goes back and ties back and links back to the assessment. So everything starts at that engagement and assessment process and then is connected back to that. And all of that link, that entire process is documented in a clear and defined way that we refer to as the golden thread. So ultimately, we're looking at how the needs are assessed. How is that documented? How does those needs, that assessment, lead to specific goals? And how those treatment goals are articulated and formulated in a way that is measurable? And then there's specific interventions that are derived from that plan, and interventions that connect to the assessed needs. So you actually engaging in activities that are speaking to the assessed needs, and a treatment plan that really clearly defines how and what and whom is responsible for what in this process of providing services are documented. The service plan orders every single action and how that is documented and what occurs during that process of implementing that services and the outcome thereof. So it may seem complicated, but it really is a clearly defined link. There is every link in that chain is clearly defined in the golden thread. And we'll talk some more about how that really is articulated and defined. So why is the golden thread important? As much as we talk about compliance and the fact that it reflects what quality of service we provide and what outcomes are derived from those services, we need to have a clearer picture of why it is important, so that when we are applying those the elements of the golden thread, it makes sense and it motivates us to keep in alignment with the golden thread. So it is consistent with psychiatric rehabilitation values and methods. And that's critical and important because we want to be working consistently and concertedly through that prism and guidance from the philosophy of psychiatric rehabilitation. Hence why we align ourselves with the values, the goals, and the principles of psych rehab. Medicaid requires it as part of the provision of service, as a part of provision of best practices and ensuring reimbursement. It promotes the provision of quality services. Because it has those connections and links and alignment with psych rehab services and psych rehab practices, it ensures the implementation and provision of quality services. It established a framework for reliable documentation. Across all entities, we have a clear way of discerning, reliable, comprehensive, and consistent documentation using the golden thread. And it ultimately supports rehabilitation and recovery, because once those elements are in place, there is a great or a greater essence that it's going to result in an outcome that reflects rehabilitation and recovery practices. What is important for us as staff and folks working in the field and understanding why there's that connection is that when we look at it from an external source who review us, right? An external reviewer who's looking at your documentation and your practices must be able to clearly track the thread. The need for services on the evaluation, that should link into the recommendations from that evaluation. Then we should be able to understand clearly how these are translated into goals and proposed activities or interventions for the staff and the client on the individualized service plan. And then how the proposed activities are finally turned or implemented into intentional actions and services. And ultimately, how the outcomes are tracked in your progress notes. So it may seem like a winding path, but it's clearly defined and it has a clear expectation at the end. Your progress note should reflect your engagement, the outcomes, and whether or not quality services are provided where that person is in proximity to their expected outcomes. And the golden thread really lends a clear guide and picture to that. So let's look at the relationship between the golden thread and psychiatric rehabilitation, because obviously there's a clear and defined link there. What the golden thread does is that it really sets out that documentation framework, which then helps to promote and support best practices in psych rehab, which is evidenced by treatment approaches that are empirical. So we talk about evidence-based practices, which then helps to create an atmosphere, create a circumstance where Medicaid reimbursable services are provided, and these services meet compliance because it has a standard operation path that leads to intended and purposeful engagement that should result in outcomes that are aligned with psych rehab, which are recovery, community integration, and quality of life. So at the end of the day, all of the documentation, actions, and activities should really reflect a path that hopefully ends in rehabilitation, and recovery for the person engaged in that services. And the golden thread helps to really define that and articulate it and lay it out clearly for anyone to see, particularly someone reviewing it from the outside. So that's the relationship between the golden thread and psychiatric rehabilitation, really setting up that framework. How do we promote best practices in psych rehab using the golden thread and really consistent and comprehensive documentation? We want to make sure that all our actions and how we document it are really aligned with the values, principles, and methods of psych rehabilitation. From autonomy to empowerment to recovery to self-directed action, they must be all emboldened and encompassing those actions and documentation. We want to ensure that our actions and documentation are reflecting the emphasis on emotional, social, and vocational well-being, those learnings, those skills development, that sense of awareness of a path to those outcomes. We want to ensure that we are demonstrating the implementation of evidence-based practices. And for most of us, we have a sense as to what those evidence-based practices look like, the common ones that we use in psych rehab, from cognitive behavioral therapy and strategies to illness management and recovery, social skills training, and supported employment to really promote and encourage vocational well-being of folks. Ultimately, the efforts that we take, all described in the golden thread, should really reflect the desired outcomes of recovery, quality of life, and community integration. What that speaks to is that your efforts and documentation should not simply reflect good intentions. It should reflect a guided process with a clear and defined outcome of that of psych rehab. Recovery, quality of life, community integration. All the skills, the empowerment, the motivation should be driving in that direction, to that intended outcome. So when we speak of Medicaid and the golden thread, we're really looking at those critical areas of engagement and services, from really assessing medical necessity to provide the opportunity and basically authorization to provide the services, to developing that individualized service plan, to documenting those services, to ensuring the services tie back to the assessment and the goal and the person's aspirations, and ultimately to reflect outcomes that are aligned with psychiatric rehabilitation goals. In essence, there is a reasonable expectation that psychiatric rehab services listed on the service plan will lead to improved symptoms and level of functioning. Ultimately, it's about getting that person to the optimum functioning to live meaningfully and purposefully in the desired community and desired state with a quality of life that really reflects their desire. So the golden thread is way beyond simply documentation and effort-driven in good intended services. It's about really aligning with those outcomes.
Earl, before you move on, there was a question that came in. How do you think bingo fits this process? And can patients have a bingo deficit? And can any intervention be construed as a treatment?
I think most importantly, when we speak to interventions and the expectations, those interventions should be aligned with a guided principles and guided practice as we speak to psych rehab. And they should clearly reflect a path to the goals of psych rehab. So we speak classically to that concept that if we constantly engage in crisis management with that person, those elements should be on the service plan so that we are committed to a targeted approach to getting that person to quality of life, recovery, and community integration. So your interventions has to be purposeful and not just purposeful in the sense that you hope that it works. It must be aligned with a guided way of getting to those psych rehab outcomes. And we'll speak some more to that in terms of what it looks like in the intervention. Hope I'm able to that kind of give some insight into what was being asked there. So we also speak of documenting with a clear understanding as to what our third-party payers are expecting. It's part of what we do. We have to actually ensure that we are meeting those expectations. So we're documenting medical necessity to authorize the service and to meet reimbursement criteria. We're maintaining compliance and accreditation to ensure that we are able to finance and maintain the service, and we are assessing outcomes of the service and treatment. So medical necessity varies across different states. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on really drilling down into that because that can be varied based on the state that you're in. So for New Jersey, I think we have some common ones, and some of them are very consistent across different states. But ultimately, the most critical one, and I wouldn't say critical, probably the most common one is that there's an expectation that the services provided really should be targeted at a diagnosed condition and a clear deficit in functioning or a challenge in managing the person's overall functioning. And ultimately, there is an expectation that the service that you are providing should have a clear and likely expectation that it should improve the person's level of functioning to move them to a more autonomous life. And I encourage you to really take a look at the definition of medical necessity across all states. And there is a clickable link on the presentation that really goes through all of the states' criteria for medical necessity. So we shift to really what that documentation looks like after really spending some time on the philosophy and the principle and the values and the concepts behind the service we provide. We now want to look at documenting. How do we articulate it? How is it really gauged and measured and evaluated in terms of its purpose, its outcome, and how we archive or how we articulate it in a way that really stands as a legal document and stands the test of time when it's reviewed. Hence, Medicaid compliant documentation. Or for most third-party payers, there's a level of compliance and a guide to how and why we should maintain compliance and adherence with the expectations. So we start out, first of all, with a comprehensive assessment. So we know that it's common as where most of our initial engagement and a sense of whom we're dealing with, what we have to deal with, and what is the best defined services that is going to give us a tested and a proven and an evidence-based way of addressing those concerns. And that starts with a comprehensive assessment. In psychiatric rehabilitation, the assessment really should identify a person's hopes, dreams, and aspirations. And that should really morph into the goals. So once we've been able to document medical necessity to authorize the services, we need to then begin to look at the personhood, the person's presenting condition, as well as all the other all-encompassing elements of that person's life that is really going to be impacted by the service we provide. So we really try our very best to ensure that we're identifying the unmet needs, we're identifying strengths and the value life roles that the person brings to the table. We want to incorporate a multidimensional wellness focus in our assessment, because as we know, a person is a collection of many dimensions, right, of their lives. It's not just the presenting mental health problem that we're trying to address. We're addressing that whole personhood and how mental illness or how the challenges in functioning may be impacting that whole person's functioning. So the hope is once we have addressed or looked at an incorporated multidimensional wellness focus, we're able to really derive or create or formulate a set of identified goals and objectives on a plan that we can then put into action. So once we do that assessment, that deep dive into areas that are mutually agreed upon and prioritized for that person, we should be able to then create goals and objectives that come from that multidimensional assessment. And that will lead us from that assessment to how do we then move to developing an individualized rehabilitation plan. One of the ways that psych rehab speaks to that is really looking at the knowledge, skills, and resources. And we often coin that as the KSR. But the knowledge, skills, and resources really speaks to the strengths and challenges that persons face in their whole life, and particularly those associated with their current functional challenges. So we really look at evaluating and assessing what the person needs to know to get to their goal. What do they need to have? What do they need to do to actually meet the intended goal? So we brainstorm and we assess and we categorize those knowledge, skills, and resources needed to meet the goals. And that's the framework for what we consider unmet needs. Because typically, if a person is either unable to function in a way that really helps them attain that quality of life, or attain recovery or community integration, it's really about some area of skills, knowledge, and resource that is not currently where it needs to be. It's not optimized. And I challenge you to see if you can find any client that you maybe have engaged with or provided service to, where their needs does not fall into the category of knowledge, skills, and resources. I've yet to find someone who says, okay, any need that a person presents doesn't fall into knowledge, skills, and resources, even if they are, in different areas. Typically they are. So once we've been able to assess that, we use that knowledge, skills, and resource that the person has or the person desire And that helps us to identify related intervention that match the objectives, and it drives the service. Because a classic example is someone is experiencing a depressive episode, and we speak to that person in terms of what is it that they would need to get to a greater state of function and a better quality of life. Person is likely to articulate to you clearly that I desire to learn how to cope with those triggers or those elements that leads to me feeling depressed and leads to my limited functioning in the desired area. And that may be a specific skill to cope. It may be a knowledge as to how to anticipate the triggers, or how to anticipate or understand the environment that promotes that kind of challenge. It may also require, a resource in terms of whom do I seek support from, where do I get appropriate services, whom do I get just a listening ear from. So all of those categories, the knowledge, skills, and resource, are really how that person may be able to frame their unmet needs and create a plan that really reflects process towards those needs or progress towards those needs. So it's important for us to do the KSR assessment as part of the development of the service plan or the individualized rehab plan. So let's look at the individualized rehab plan or service plan. What's the elements that has to be in there to ensure that it's aligned with psych rehab so that it really promotes movement and progress towards desired outcomes, hopes, dreams, aspirations, and the goals of psych rehab, quality of life, recovery, community integration? How does someone get from their current state to the state of really attaining those goals in those areas? The service plan needs to be linked, it needs to be identified in the assessment. So those unmet needs are what derive, what we pull to create the service plan. It really includes the desired outcomes relevant to the presenting problems. As I spoke to the person experiencing the depressive episodes and moods, and the person's desire to be more in a state where they are managing, aware of those challenges, but managing those aspects of their lives so that they're functioning as optimally as they can in spite of feeling down, in spite of feeling not fully their best self. The service plan needs to have a clear goal statement, and it includes SMART objectives. There's an expectation that your goals and objectives needs to be written in SMART format. It clearly describes the interventions and service types. What kind of service you're providing? Is it individual treatment, group services? It's important to have that clearly defined. It needs to address the frequency, duration of this intervention, and who's providing those interventions. What qualified staff is providing those interventions in keeping with that person's skill set, the knowledge set, and the ability to provide those services in a meaningful, intentional way. And I don't think speaking of a service plan is anything new and novel to you. So I'm just kind of trying to tackle and reinforce those critical elements. ISP goals is the building block of the plan, right? They need to be written in SMART format. And someone would ask, what does that look like, Earl? A good example is when we speak to a SMART goal. I'll give you an example. Peppermint Patty will improve our overall mood in the next 3 to 6 months, as evidenced by a reduction in self-harming behaviors and self-report of an overall improvement in the mood, on a scale of 0 being low and 10 being high. It's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, and it has a time-bound, a time-specific element to it. I don't think I have to overstate the SMART element. I think most of us are commonly acquainted with that. And if not, there's lots of material that really can provide some guide for us. There's an expectation that we are working with along the concept of a strength-based goal planning, right? How do we not simply plan and create and formulate goals, but ensure that they're strength-based? They need to really, those goals that we create needs to reflect the person's identified hopes, dreams, and aspirations. We're not asking you to be grandiose in those expectations, but they should reflect that. If the person hopes to live meaningfully and purposefully in the community, that should be reflected in the goals that they're working towards, right? Whether that is learning how to identify the community of choice, determine what are the skills, knowledge, and resources to attain housing, understanding what resources in our community will help that person attain the quality of life. That's the expectation. We want to focus on the person's strengths, interests, resources, and capabilities. We want to ensure that that person that we're working with, that client we're providing services, is intimately involved in that treatment planning process to the best of their ability. And we talk about identifying those valued life roles. That person's most significant life role is to be a parent or to be a good citizen. We want to ensure that we are focused on that and we are targeting that as an element and a focus of what we're doing in every element of the service. There are some clear benefits to strength-based approach to goal planning. It offers a shared language and philosophy. Everyone can understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what drives it. It's important that we do so to ensure that we are promoting respect and compassion, and an awareness that it takes time to build a client's capacity. So when we're talking about strength, we want to make sure that it's stage specific and the person has that readiness, confidence to change. They understand where they are in the change process. So we're not creating an intervention that is really our goal that is beyond that person's readiness, awareness, and capacity. And we're not ignoring vulnerabilities or weakness. We're aware that the person has significant challenges that may be profoundly limiting their ability to function in the way they desire. The objective on a service plan is also significant in that, once again, we expect that they are the smaller steps to accomplishing those goals. They should really reflect those unmet knowledge, skills, and resources that we spoke about earlier, and establish benchmarks for progress, right? If a person meets one of the objectives, it should have a clear and definitive way of measuring where they are in proximity to the goal, because that objective is one small step towards that goal. And it helps to boost motivation and promote autonomy once that person has early wins, early victories. They achieve an objective, they're on the path, they feel I can do it. There's a clear way of getting to the next step. Those interventions are specific. They must include frequency, duration, and the qualified staff assigned to the activity. And they should really be focused on restoring functioning, not simply ameliorating symptoms or modifying symptoms, but really about really tuning into that person's hopes, dreams, and aspirations, and those goals for psych rehab. How do they see themselves in proximity to recovery? And it should reflect the consideration for the person's stage of change. We want to ensure that an objective reflects where that person is in the stage of change. If that person is still in a contemplative mode, the objective can't be about an action-based effort, because what will be happening likely is that that person will not be ready and committed to doing that. We have to ensure that readiness, commitment, awareness, and the stage of change is aligned with the objective. So obviously this is not foolproof. There's some challenges to really creating a impactful service plan. And oftentimes the challenges are, sometimes the goals and objectives are the same as the interventions. You have to have that clearly defined. A goal cannot be written in the same manner as an objective, because the goal is that big picture, the objective is the small steps towards that big picture. As we all know, if the goals do not really address the Medicaid billable services, it's unlikely that service will be authorized, and we'll be working at odds with our third-party funders. If the goals are not identified in a strengths-based manner, it really undermines that person's motivation and commitment to working at it. Ultimately, these efforts are designed to ensure that we're providing intentional services. When we speak to intentional services, we are speaking to services that are specifically intended to meet a certain outcome, the psych rehab goal. We have to have a sense as to what is the intent and energy we're bringing to that service. The methodology, the approach we're taking to meet the outcome should be clear to us and the person receiving the services. And ultimately, we want that big goal or big service plan to really be translated into moment-to-moment supports, right? A person should be able to break it down into what are we doing in this moment that really is aligned with me meeting my outcome. Hence, intentional service. Not simply, what is it you'd like me to help you with today? No, it's going to that plan, having that clear plan, speaking to a specific objective and goal and intervention that that person is aware of, and that person is committed to and ready to act on. And ultimately, we reach progress notes, which is the ultimate way of really putting all of that together and ensuring that there's a clear picture of what we did, why we did what we did, what was the outcome from doing it, and what can we learn? What's our next step? What we learned from that whole engagement, and what do we intend to do next to ensure that we're moving in the right direction? Progress notes, written in many ways. We have many models of progress notes. I'm not even going to try touching them, but typically the most common one is the DAP note. That is written in most of our services. Data, assessment, planning. What's the next effort? It really includes the goals, objectives, the location of services, the client's response to the intervention, right? Notable changes since the last engagement with that person. What are they currently presenting? What it looks like? Are they oriented to all? What's the plan for follow-up after that service, after evaluating and assessing and documenting the outcome of that service? And most importantly, ensure that the appropriate signatures and titles and credentials are there to confirm who did it and whether that person is qualified to provide that service, clearly articulated in the service plan. When writing progress notes, here's some quick guidelines for you to kind of remember and to think of. Don't rely on subjective statements. Ensure that what you're writing is based on the evidence that you have, and it's a reflection of what can be assessed. As much as you may have great intuition and insight into that, a progress note should really reflect what is evident in your service, the person's reaction to the service, and the outcome. Avoid excessive details. Just write what truly happened, what was the impact of it, and how it did align with the expected goals and objectives. Avoid shorthands, shortcuts, and jargons. Not everyone is within your scope and within your profession. Remember, progress notes are legal documents. They can be subpoenaed by court. They can be reviewed by family members and loved ones. ensure you're writing in a way that anyone can understand and clearly articulate and envision what was done, why it was done, and what was the impact of it. Someone not familiar with the individual should be able to understand what occurred during the service session from your progress notes. Simple as that. There's lots of difficulty. Oftentimes, ones that can be resolved or addressed as it relates to the golden thread. And it's important to understand what those are, right? There may be assessment deficits, diagnosis poorly supported, symptoms and behaviors and deficit oriented, no baseline established to gauge progress or lack thereof. That can certainly create a challenge for sticking to the golden thread. As well as we look at some areas in the individualized service plan and progress notes that can create a problem for truly aligning and maintaining adherence to the golden thread. But if you truly look at the intent, the path, the connectivity of the golden thread, the purpose of it, how it helps not only meet compliance and accreditation, but it truly articulates and reflects quality services and gives you a good sense as to the impact of how you have provided the services and the service you provide, and that person is able to use that same information to get a sense of where they are in alignment with their goals and expected outcome. You will see that the golden thread is not only a critical element of providing good services, but it really helps you to have a sense of accomplishment, purpose, and truly be able to feel confident about the service you provided, the purpose for providing that services, and the impact and the outcome of that service. And that's the most significant aspect of it. The golden thread is really not just to safeguard you and your agency from an audit or during an audit. It really helps you see the purpose of your efforts and professional engagement with the person that you're serving in a compassionate, thoughtful, intentional, directed way that reflects quality efforts and quality service. And I'm going to end with this in mind, a reminder, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And that does not mean simply that your efforts were not accounted for. It means that all the things that should come from that service has not been appropriately, professionally, and ethically outlined. And that is not just your responsibility, but it should be your professional standard that you should want to have that not only established and defined, but reflected so that you can look at what you have done and feel proud and good about your efforts and the professional standard by which you align. And that is the message I want to ensure that is sent, and I'm hoping that you get the takeaway that was intended from this course. But thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Earl. We do have some time for questions. It's 3:50. We have about 10 minutes. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box.
Sure.
I know you guys, every evaluation, you said there wasn't enough time for questions. So here we are. Here's your chance. Let's see them. Earl, can you just, while people are thinking about their questions, can you advance to the slide
Absolutely.
that has the resources on it? Yeah, all of these links to these resources are in the training evaluation. There was a question that came in. This is, I find often this type of planning and documentation is difficult with unwilling or unable participants. How do you adjust for that?
That's a very good question, and thank you for bringing that to the forefront. I think more than anything else, what it does is it gives you a clear picture of what the intent of this is. So if you are struggling to move directionally in that concept, you don't look at it as though it's some personal failure. You can objectively review and reassess whether the technique, the approach, the way in which the service is provided is appropriate for this person's current functioning. A classic example is if someone is really in psychosis, if you look at it from that knowledge, skills, and resource concept, it would be easy to then see that, okay, that person is not ready to really internalize those things. But you can actually look at that person at that engagement and speak to what would be the first step towards feeling better or actually having some clarity. And for that person, it may simply be, I want to be heard and listened to. And that essentially may be the ultimate goal for that time and place for that person. Or safety. It may simply be, in that moment, a matter of harm reduction for that person. How does the environment be modified to restrict or limit harm? Maybe it.
Thank you, Earl. There was another question about bingo that Troublemaker Tom popped in with. Back to bingo, how might this be a part of the thread? And Margaret responded saying bingo can be a great assessment tool. Organization, visual, scanning, attention, pattern recognition, emotional response to success and frustration. Very interesting. How would that,
yes,
if all that is documented, right?
That's the important element. That is documented, because even if your initial efforts may not have the intended outcome, someone following or someone working in alignment with you can start at that point and have a place to start.
Thank you. Any other questions coming in? Still a few more minutes.
All right.
Earl, would you like to explain what some of the resources, the links that we have up on the screen are?
Absolutely, yes. So I know for a number of folks like myself, sometimes really going back to that psych rehab principles and values may seem arduous, but it's a good place to start, because it gives you a framework for why you do what you do and how you do it, so you're not really languishing in that place of I'm either successful or failing. You're aligning with a principle that is evidence-based and tested. We look at the basis for psychiatric rehab. We want to make sure that setting goals and developing a specific, particularly that SMART concept, is guided by a good, simple way of looking at it. Because oftentimes it's a challenge to just be like, okay, am I writing this in a SMART format based on my way of seeing it? But really using a good guide to measure your alignment with that is a lot helpful than really just having your vision to gauge it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to, if you could advance the slide one, Earl.
Sure.
I think, there's references, and then the next one, more references. Contact Earl. I'm putting this in the chat box again. If you have to leave or don't get a chance to do this today, you know, we send out a follow-up email tomorrow that will provide this link for you. And from that link, you can access all the training materials, the handouts, and a certificate of attendance for today's webinar. So Earl, I want to thank you so much. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I want to thank you for your time and expertise for the webinar today. And we appreciate you being here and sharing this information. Everyone else, we'll see you next month. Take care.